It's 2 a.m. and you're staring at the ceiling, doing the math on a future that hasn't happened yet. The bill, the diagnosis, the decision you keep circling but can't make. You've prayed about it, you've asked God to take it. And for a moment, maybe it lifted, but morning comes, and the fear is already there, waiting, like it never actually left. And underneath all of it is something heavier than the fear itself. The quiet shame of still feeling afraid after every prayer, every verse, every time you told yourself to just trust God. So now you're not only anxious, you're anxious, and ashamed of being anxious, wondering if your fear is proof that something is broken in your relationship with God. You've heard the words, "Do not be anxious" before, and maybe they landed less like an invitation and more like a verdict on something you're already failing to do. But what if that's not what those words ever meant? What if the fear you feel tonight isn't evidence that your faith is weak, but a signal pointing somewhere else entirely? It's late again, and you're lying there in the dark, staring at a ceiling you've memorized by now, and your mind will not stop moving. You tell yourself to sleep, but sleep isn't the thing your body wants. Your body wants answers. Your mind keeps replaying the same scenes on a looped conversation that didn't go well. The bill that's due, the diagnosis you're still waiting on, the decision you keep circling but never actually make. None of it is new information. You've thought through all of it 100 times already, but the loop doesn't care that you've already thought it through. It just keeps running, like a machine that doesn't know how to turn itself off. And somewhere underneath all of it, quieter than the noise, but somehow louder than anything else, is a feeling you don't say out loud to anyone. Fear. Not the dramatic kind. Not the kind that makes you scream or run the slow kind. The kind that sits in your chest and tightens a little more every time you think about tomorrow. You're afraid of what's coming. Maybe you don't even know exactly what it is. Maybe it's not. One thing it's everything at once. A future that feels unsteady, undefined, like ground that hasn't been tested yet. You've prayed about this more than once. You've said the words, ask God to take it from you. Ask for peace. Ask for an answer. And for a moment, maybe it eased. But then morning comes, and somehow the fear is already there waiting for you, like it never actually left, like it was just resting while you slept. And so you start the day already tired. Tired in a way that has nothing to do with how many hours you slept. It's a different kind of exhaustion, the kind that comes from carrying something invisible that nobody else can see. From the outside, you look fine. You go to work, you answer messages, you smile when someone asks how you're doing. But inside, there's this quiet hum of worry that never fully shuts off. And here's the part that makes it heavier than the fear itself, the shame underneath it. Because somewhere along the way, you picked up this idea. Maybe nobody ever said it directly, but you absorbed it anyway, that if your faith was strong enough, this anxiety wouldn't be here. That real trust in God would erase the fear completely. That if you were spiritually where you should be, you'd feel calm, not consumed. So now you're not just anxious, you're anxious and ashamed of being anxious. You're afraid of the future and afraid that being afraid means something is wrong with your relationship with God. It becomes a strange, exhausting double weight, the original fear, and then the guilt layered on top of it for still feeling that fear after all the prayers, after all the verses you've read, after all the times you've told yourself to just trust God and felt like you failed when the worry came back anyway. Maybe you've even started to wonder if God is disappointed in you, if He's watching you spiral through the same worries night after night and shaking His head, wondering why you can't just let it go. Maybe you've wondered if your prayers are even getting through, because nothing seems to be changing. The situation is still uncertain. The future is still unclear. And you're still lying awake, still running the same scenarios, still feeling like you're somehow failing a test you didn't even know you were taking. This is the place so many people living quietly, not in crisis, not falling apart on the outside, but carrying a constant undercurrent of dread about what's ahead. What if I lose my job? What if my health gets worse? What if this relationship doesn't survive? What if I make the wrong decision and ruin everything? What if I'm just not ready for whatever's coming next? The questions multiply faster than the answers ever could. And so the real question underneath all of this, the one you may not have said out loud but that lives in you every single day, is this: how do I stop being anxious about a future I cannot control, cannot predict, and cannot fully understand? You've heard the phrase before, do not. be anxious. Maybe you've read it in scripture. Maybe someone quoted it to you in a moment when you were already struggling. Meaning well, but landing wrong. Like it was a command you were failing to keep. As if God were standing over you, arms crossed, saying, "Stop feeling that." The same way someone might tell a child to stop crying without understanding why the tears started in the first place. And if that's how you've heard it, then of course, it feels impossible. Of course, it feels like one more thing you're not doing right. Because how do you simply switch off fear? How do you command your own heart to stop reacting to real uncertainty, real risk, real unknowns that could genuinely affect your life? It sounds, on the surface, like an instruction that ignores how minds actually work, how bodies actually respond to threat, how deeply human it is to feel afraid of what you cannot see coming. But what if that's not what those words ever meant? What if "do not be anxious" was never meant to be heard as a rebuke, but is something else entirely, something closer to an invitation rather than a verdict? What if the fear you feel is not proof that your faith is weak, but a signal, a kind of pointer, showing you exactly where your trust still needs to grow? Not because you're failing, but because you're human. And growth always starts at the place where something is still tender. There's a difference between fear being your enemy and fear being your teacher. And right now, you might not yet know which one it actually is in your life. That's the tension sitting underneath everything you're feeling tonight. The thing not fully answered yet. The thing worth slowing down for. Because if anxiety isn't actually the opposite of faith, if it isn't a sign of spiritual failure, then what is it? And if God's command not to be anxious isn't dismissive, isn't cold, isn't asking you to pretend you don't feel what you feel, then what is it actually asking of you instead? That's where this needs to go next. Because the answer changes everything about how you carry the nights like this one. Lying awake, afraid of what's coming, wondering if you're doing faith wrong simply because you still feel human. Let's start by naming the misunderstanding directly, because it's the thing quietly making everything heavier than it needs to be. Somewhere along the way, many people absorb this idea that anxiety and faith cannot exist in the same space. That if faith is present, fear should be absent. That feeling afraid is proof of a crack somewhere in your trust. Evidence that you haven't fully surrendered, haven't fully believed, haven't fully arrived at whatever spiritual level would supposedly make you immune to worry. And once that belief takes root, every wave of anxiety becomes a double blow. First, the fear itself, and then the inner accusation that follows. You are failing. You're not trusting enough. Something is wrong with you spiritually. But here's something worth sitting with for a moment. Nowhere does the instruction to release anxiety say that feeling fear is the same as failing God. That's an assumption added on top of the original words, not something that was actually in them. Read carefully. The invitation isn't stop feeling, it's bring what you feel somewhere. It's not suppression, it's redirection. It's not pretend the fear isn't there. It's don't let the fear be the final destination of your attention. There's a profound difference between feeling afraid and staying trapped in fear. Feeling afraid is human. Staying trapped is what happens when fear has nowhere to go, when it just circles inside you with no outlet, no exchange, no movement. The instruction was never about achieving a fear-free emotional state through sheer willpower. It was about what you do with the fear once it shows up. Do you let it spiral alone in your mind, multiplying in the dark? Or do you bring it into the light of relationship, into prayer, into honesty before God? This reframes everything. Because if anxiety is a signal rather than a sin, then its appearance in your life isn't evidence against your faith, it's an invitation into your faith. It's your heart, in its own way, pointing back toward the place where dependence on God is supposed to happen. Anxiety often shows up exactly where control has slipped out of your hands, exactly where you cannot fix, force, or finalize an outcome on your own. And that helplessness, that exposure of your limits, is uncomfortable, yes, but it's also the precise location where trust becomes necessary rather than optional. You don't need to trust God for things you can already control. Trust becomes real exactly in the places where control runs out. So when fear surfaces about tomorrow, about your health, about your finances, about a relationship hanging in uncertainty, what's actually happening underneath is your own heart bumping up against its limits, against the edge of what you can manage alone. That edge isn't a failure point. It's a starting point. It's where faith is supposed to begin operating, not where it's supposed to have already finished its work. Think about what changes if you let yourself believe this. Instead of feeling shame the next time worry rises, what if you treated that rising feeling as information rather than indictment? What if, instead of immediately judging yourself for feeling afraid, you simply asked, what is this fear pointing me to? What am I trying to control right now that was never mine to control in the first place? This doesn't erase the discomfort of fear, but it changes your relationship to it. It moves you from being ashamed of feeling human to being curious about what your humanity is revealing. There's also something important in the word anxious itself. The way it's often tied not just to fear of a single event, but to fragmentation of the mind being pulled in many directions at once. Worry about the past, mixing with worry about the future, scattering your attention so thin that you're present nowhere, not even in the moment you're actually living in right now. That scattering is part of why anxiety feels so exhausting. It's not just fear, it's fractured fear, multiplied across a dozen unresolved threads at once. And so the invitation to exchange worry for prayer isn't a magic formula that instantly resolves outcomes. It's something closer to gathering those scattered threads and bringing them to one place. One presence, instead of letting them spin endlessly inside your own mind alone. Practically, this might look like something very small. The next time you notice that familiar tightening in your chest, that loop starting up again about something unresolved, try pausing just long enough to name it specifically. Not vaguely, I'm anxious, but specifically, I'm afraid that this decision will turn out to be wrong and I won't be able to undo it, or I'm afraid my health is declining and I won't have the strength I need. Naming it pulls it out of the formless cloud of generalized dread and gives it shape. And once it has shape, it can actually be brought somewhere, spoken honestly in prayer, not polished, not performed, just said plainly, the way you'd say something hard to someone you trusted completely. This is different from simply distracting yourself from the fear, and it's different from trying to think positive thoughts until the fear goes away. It's an act of honesty rather than an act of avoidance. There is real relief available in this shift, even before anything about your circumstances changes. Because part of what makes anxiety so heavy is the isolation of it, the sense that you're carrying this alone. Turning it over and over in your own mind with no outside support, the moment you stop treating fear as a verdict against your faith and start treating it as a doorway into deeper honesty with God, something in the weight begins to redistribute. You're no longer fighting fear and shame at the same time. You're simply bringing fear somewhere, the way it was always meant to be carried, not alone, not in silence, not in shame, but in relationship. Still, this raises another question worth sitting with. Because naming the fear and bringing it to prayer doesn't automatically make the uncertain outcome certain. The future is still unknown. The diagnosis still hasn't come back. The decision still has to be made without full information. So if fear isn't the enemy, and shame isn't the answer, what do you actually do with the part of you that still wants to control what happens next? The part of you that keeps trying to grip tightly onto a future you cannot see and cannot guarantee. That's where the real tension lives, and it's worth looking at closely, because the grip itself, the constant mental effort to control the uncontrollable, might be exhausting you far more than the actual circumstances ever could. There's a particular kind of exhaustion that comes not from what's actually happening in your life, but from the constant mental effort of trying to control what hasn't happened yet. You can feel it in the way your mind keeps running scenarios. If this happens, then I'll do that. But if that happens instead, then I'll need a different plan. And what if neither of those happens and something worse comes instead? Around and around it goes, building elaborate contingency plans for a future that hasn't arrived and may never look anything like what you're imagining. This is the quiet, exhausting work anxiety often does. Not just feeling afraid, but trying to manage the unmanageable through sheer mental effort, as if enough thinking, enough preparation, enough anticipation could somehow secure an outcome that hasn't been decided yet. And underneath that effort is a belief most people never examine directly. If I can just think about this enough, plan for it enough, prepare for every possible version of it, then maybe I can keep myself safe. Maybe I can prevent the worst from happening simply by never letting my guard down. But here's the uncomfortable truth worth sitting with. That sense of control was always, in some sense, an illusion. Not because effort and wisdom and planning don't matter, they do, but because no amount of mental rehearsal, can actually secure tomorrow. You can prepare wisely for what's ahead, and that's good stewardship. But there's a difference between wise preparation and anxious control. And the difference is in the posture underneath it. Wise preparation does what it can and then rests. Anxious control keeps gripping even after there's nothing left to do, replaying the same scenarios long after action has been taken, because the gripping itself has become the only thing that feels like doing something. It feels productive, even though it produces nothing except exhaustion. This is part of why fear about the future can feel so relentless. It's not actually about the future at all. Not really. It's about the discomfort of not knowing, and the mind's desperate attempt to convert that unknown into something it can manage through thought alone. But the future was never something you were meant to carry that way. Releasing the illusion of control isn't the same as releasing responsibility or becoming passive about your life. It's recognizing the specific point where your responsibility ends and trust is meant to begin. You can make the decision in front of you wisely. You can take the next right step with the information you actually have, but you cannot guarantee the outcome. And the constant mental effort to guarantee it is precisely what's draining you. Surrender, in this sense, isn't giving up. It's recognizing what was never yours to hold in the first place. Think about what it would actually feel like to set something down that you were never strong enough to carry alone to begin with. Not because you're weak, but because some weights were never designed for human hands. The outcome of tomorrow, the result of a diagnosis, not yet known. The final shape of a relationship still unfolding, these were never things you were meant to secure through mental force. And yet so much energy gets spent trying anyway, because letting go feels like losing control, and losing control feels dangerous. But what if the danger was never in releasing the grip? What if the real exhaustion has been in holding on to something that kept slipping no matter how tightly you held it? This is where prayer becomes something different than simply asking God to fix the situation. It becomes the practical act of transferring weight. Not once, dramatically, and then it's over, but repeatedly. The way you might set something down and then notice yourself picking it back up an hour later and have to set it down again. This is normal. This is not failure. The mind that has spent years gripping tightly doesn't release its grip permanently in a single prayer. It releases gradually through practice, through repetition. The same way any deeply formed habit changes not instantly, but through consistent small acts repeated over time. So when the fear rises again tonight, when the scenarios start looping, the practice isn't to muscle your way into calm through sheer determination. The practice is to notice the grip, name what you're trying to control, and consciously hand it over again. God, I don't know what's going to happen with this. I've been trying to control it in my mind, and I can't actually control it. I'm setting it down again. This might feel almost too simple, too small to matter against something as large as your fear feels. But this is exactly the kind of small, repeated surrender that begins shifting something underneath the surface, even when nothing about your circumstances has visibly changed yet. There's a kind of relief available here that doesn't depend on the outcome being resolved. It's the relief of no longer being solely responsible for securing your own future through mental force. It's the relief of remembering that wisdom does its part, and then trust does the rest, and that those two things were never meant to be in competition with each other. You can be wise and prepared and still trust. In fact, real trust often shows up most clearly, exactly there, in the space after you've done what you can, and the outcome still isn't yours to determine. This doesn't mean the fear disappears instantly the moment you decide to let go. It often returns, sometimes within the hour, sometimes the next morning, exactly like it has before. But each time it returns, you have a choice that wasn't as visible before. You can either let it pull you back into the old pattern of anxious gripping, replaying scenarios as if thinking harder will produce certainty, or you can recognize the pattern for what it is and set it down again, deliberately, as a practice rather than a one-time fix. Over time, this is what begins to loosen anxiety's grip knot, a single dramatic breakthrough, but the accumulation of many small acknowledgments that control was never actually yours to hold, many small returns to trust, even when the outcome still isn't visible. And this raises something worth carrying into what comes next. If releasing control is part of the answer, then there's still the matter of what fills the space that control used to occupy, because simply letting go of something doesn't automatically replace it with peace. So if not control, then what? And why does the fear seem to grow loudest specifically in the silence? In those quiet hours, when there's nothing left to do but wait for an answer that hasn't come yet. There's a particular kind of fear that doesn't show up, loudest in crisis, but in the quiet, in the waiting room, in the early morning hours, before anyone else is awake, in the stretch of time, after you've prayed, after you've done what you can. And now there's nothing left to do but wait for something to change. This is where fear seems to grow the most, not because the situation has gotten worse, but because silence leaves so much room for the mind to fill with its own imagination. When there's no new information, no clear next step, no answer arriving, the mind doesn't simply rest in that emptiness. It tends to fill it, and it usually fills it with worst-case scenarios, because the mind, left without direction, often assumes the worst as a kind of false protection, as if imagining the worst outcome in advance will somehow soften the blow if it actually happens. This is part of why God's apparent silence feels so unbearable. It's not just that you don't have an answer yet, it's that the absence of an answer gets interpreted almost automatically as the absence of God Himself. If you were paying attention, surely He would have responded by now. If He cared the way you've been told He cares, surely this would have resolved already. And so silence starts to feel like distance. Like maybe your prayers aren't landing anywhere, like maybe you've been talking into an empty room this whole time. But here's something worth examining honestly. Silence and absence are not the same thing. A parent can be fully present in a room with a child without saying a single word, simply sitting nearby while the child works through something difficult on their own. The silence in that moment isn't neglect. It's presence without immediate intervention. It's trust that the child is being held, even without verbal reassurance every second. This doesn't mean every season of unanswered prayer has a clean explanation or a comfortable resolution waiting at the end of it. Some seasons remain genuinely hard, genuinely confusing, without quick relief. But the interpretation that silence equals abandonment is an assumption, not a fact. And it's worth questioning rather than simply accepting as true every time the fear repeats it to you. This is where prayer needs a slightly different definition than the one most people unconsciously carry. Many people approach prayer primarily as a request system and then wait to see if the request gets granted, and judge God's presence or absence based on whether the outcome arrives on the timeline expected. But prayer was never meant to function only as a transaction. Fix this and then I'll feel close to you. Prayer, at its core, is relationship. It's communication, presence, honesty, the ongoing practice of staying connected to God, regardless of whether the specific circumstance has shifted yet. When prayer becomes only about fixing the external situation, the silence around that situation becomes unbearable, because the only thing that would prove God's newness is the resolution itself. But when prayer becomes about realigning your attention to His presence in this moment, the silence stops being the only measure of whether He's near. Practically, this might look like shifting the actual content of your prayer. Instead of only saying, "God, please change this. Please fix this. Please make this resolve the way I need it to." Try adding something different alongside it. "God, meet me here in the middle of not knowing. Help me feel your presence, even while the situation stays the same." This isn't abandoning the request, it's widening what you're actually asking for. You're no longer asking God only to alter your circumstances. You're asking Him to be present within them, which is something He can do immediately, even while the bigger situation is still unfolding on its own timeline. There's something important to notice here too. The ache of unanswered prayer is real, and it shouldn't be minimized or explained away too quickly. It hurts to ask for something sincerely and watch days, weeks, months pass without visible change. That pain is legitimate. But the pain of unanswered prayer and the absence of God's presence are two separate things, even though they often get fused together in the mind. You can be in genuine pain about an unresolved situation while still being genuinely accompanied through it. Those two realities can coexist, even though it doesn't feel that way in the hardest moments. This reframing doesn't remove the discomfort of waiting, and it's not meant to. It's meant to change what the waiting is interpreted as. If the waiting season is read as evidence of distance, every quiet day adds to a growing case against God's care. But if the waiting season is read as a space where presence precedes resolution, the waiting itself starts to feel less like abandonment and more like something being held, even without proof yet that it's being fixed. There's also something worth noticing about why silence specifically seems to amplify fear so intensely. When there's noise, distraction, activity, the mind has less room to spiral. But the moment everything goes quiet, the moment there's truly nothing left to do but wait, that's exactly when the unattended thoughts rise to the surface. This is often why anxiety feels worse at night, in stillness, in the absence of distraction. It's not that the fear is actually stronger in those moments, it's that there's nothing competing with it for your attention anymore. This is part of why the practice of consciously bringing your attention to God's presence in those quiet moments mattered so much. Not because it produces an instant resolution, but because it gives you attention somewhere to land besides the spiral. Instead of letting the silence fill itself automatically with worst-case imagination, you offer it something else to hold on to, even if that something else is simply the quiet acknowledgement. I don't have an answer yet, and I don't understand why this is taking so long, but I'm not actually alone in this room. This still leaves an honest question sitting underneath everything, one that doesn't disappear just because presence has been clarified. If God is present, even in the waiting, even in the unanswered seasons, then what is the waiting actually for? Is it simply something to be endured? An empty stretch of time with no purpose except enduring it until it ends? Or is there something happening within the waiting itself? Something being shaped or prepared? Even when nothing on the outside seems to be moving at all, there's a quiet assumption many people carry without ever stating it directly. The belief that delay must mean something has gone wrong. If this were truly meant for me, it would have arrived by now. If God truly wanted to bless this, the door would already be open. If this prayer truly mattered, the answer wouldn't still be pending. Delay gets interpreted as disqualification, as if the length of the wait is somehow evidenced about the worthiness of the request, or about God's willingness to act on your behalf. But waiting and rejection are not the same thing, even though they can feel almost identical from the inside, especially the longer the waiting stretches on. Think about what actually happens during long seasons of preparation in other areas of life. A foundation has to set before a structure can be built on top of it, and that setting process happens slowly, invisibly, beneath the surface, with nothing dramatic to observe while it's occurring. If you only looked at the surface during that time, you'd see nothing happening at all. No visible progress, no movement, just stillness. And yet, underneath that apparent stillness, something essential is happening, something that determines whether everything built afterward will hold weight or collapse under pressure. Many seasons of waiting function the same way in a person's inner life. What looks like nothing happening on the outside is often the slow forming of character, patience, deepened trust, clarified priorities, qualities that simply cannot be built quickly, no matter how much someone might want to skip ahead to the part where the waiting ends and the answer arrives. This doesn't mean every delay is engineered for some perfectly designed lesson, the way it sometimes gets oversimplified in well-meaning advice. Some delays are simply hard, without a clean explanation attached, and pretending otherwise can flatten something that deserves to be taken seriously rather than explained away. But there is a real and important difference between waiting that is purposeless and waiting that is unexplained. You don't always get to see the purpose while you're inside the waiting. Clarity about what a season was building often comes later. Sometimes much later, looking back rather than looking forward. This is part of why waiting feels so disorienting while it's happening, because you're being asked to trust a process you cannot yet see the shape of. It's a little like being inside a long tunnel with no clear sense of how much further it stretches. You can't see the exit point. You can't measure your progress by visible markers the way you could in open daylight. All you have is the next step in front of you, and the choice of whether to keep walking despite not being able to see the end. Practically, this reframing can change how you relate to the wait itself, even before anything visible shifts. Instead of measuring the season only by what hasn't arrived yet, what hasn't resolved yet, what's still missing, you can begin paying attention to what's actually being formed in you during this stretch of time. This might look like noticing Honestly, where you've grown in patience compared to where you were a year ago, even if the original situation still hasn't resolved. It might look like recognizing a steadiness in your prayers. Now that wasn't there before, a willingness to keep showing up in honest conversation with God, even without an answer yet, where in the past you might have given up praying about it altogether after a few unanswered weeks. It might look like noticing that your sense of identity has slowly stopped depending entirely on the outcome you're waiting for, that some quieter sense of who you are has begun forming underneath the waiting itself. None of this erases the discomfort of still not having what you're waiting for, but it changes the meaning attached to the time passing. Instead of every additional day feeling like evidence, the answer might never come. It can start to feel like material being added to something still under construction, something not yet finished, but not abandoned either. There's also something worth examining about the specific shame that often gets attached to long waiting seasons. The quiet sense that maybe you're stuck because you did something wrong, missed some step, failed some test that would have moved things forward faster if you'd only gotten it right. This kind of thinking treats waiting like a punishment for failure, rather than a natural part of how growth actually unfolds. But preparation seasons exist throughout life, in every area, not because someone failed a test, but because certain things simply require time to develop properly. A person doesn't fail by needing years to mature into a role they'll eventually carry well. The maturing itself is the necessary part, not evidence of failure along the way. This reframing matters because shame tends to make waiting feel even heavier than it already is. Waiting is hard enough without adding the extra weight of believing you're somehow at fault for how long it's taking. Releasing that particular shame doesn't make the wait shorter, but it does make it lighter to carry, because you're no longer fighting both the uncertainty of not knowing when this will resolve and the self-blame of believing you caused the delay through some personal failure. There is a way of holding a long season that says, "This is taking longer than I wanted, and I don't fully understand why. But I don't have to interpret this delay as either punishment or abandonment. I can hold it instead as unfinished, as still being formed, as something I don't yet have full visibility into." This isn't passive resignation, simply accepting whatever happens without engagement. It's active patience, which is a very different posture, one that continues praying, continues taking wise next steps, continues showing up faithfully in the meantime, while releasing the demand that the timeline match exactly what was hoped for. And this brings something important into focus that's worth carrying forward. If the wait itself isn't wasted, if something real is happening, even in this silence, even in the unresolved stretch of time, then the real battlefield isn't actually out there in the unknown future you're so afraid of. The real battlefield is somewhere much closer than that. It's inside the mind itself, in the thoughts that get rehearsed night after night, in the patterns of thinking that either deepen the fear or begin slowly to loosen its grip. If there's one place where this entire struggle is actually being decided, it isn't out there in the uncertain future, and it isn't in the circumstances still waiting to resolve. It's inside the mind, in the quiet, repeated patterns of thought that run again and again, mostly unnoticed, mostly unchallenged. Simply because they've been running so long they feel like background noise rather than something that can actually be addressed. This is worth taking seriously, because so much of anxiety isn't really about the situation itself. It's about what the mind keeps doing with the situation. The rehearsal, the looping, the constant replaying of worst-case versions of what hasn't even happened yet. The mind has an enormous capacity to imagine, and when that imagination isn't directed somewhere intentional, it tends to default toward threat, toward danger, toward the scenario that would hurt the most if it came true. This isn't a personal flaw unique to you. It's simply how an untrained mind tends to behave when left without guidance, especially under prolonged uncertainty. But here's something important to understand. The fact that a thought arises doesn't mean it has to be believed, and it doesn't mean it has to be followed wherever it wants to go. There's a difference between a thought showing up and a thought being given authority over you. Most people never make this distinction, and so every anxious thought that arrives gets treated as fact, gets responded to as if it's already true, gets reacted to with the same intensity as if the worst-case scenario had already happened, even though, in most cases, it hasn't happened and may never happen at all. This is where renewing the mind becomes something practical rather than abstract. It's not about forcing positive thoughts or pretending everything is fine when it isn't. It's about learning to notice a thought as it arrives, examine it honestly, and choose whether it deserves the authority it's currently being given. This sounds simple in description, but in practice, it requires real attention. Because anxious thought patterns often move so fast and feel so automatic that they seem indistinguishable from truth itself, the mind sees this is going to go badly, and the body responds instantly, tension rising, breath shortening, as if that statement were already confirmed fact rather than one possible imagined outcome among many. Slowing this down enough to actually examine the thought is, in itself, an act of discipline and, over time, an act of faith. It might look like this. The familiar thought arrives something like, "This is never going to get better," or "I'm going to fail at this, and everyone will see it." Instead of immediately reacting to that thought as settled truth, you pause and ask, is this actually true, or is this fear speaking? What do I actually know right now, versus what am I imagining might happen? This pause doesn't eliminate the thought instantly, and it doesn't always produce instant calm, but it interrupts the automatic chain reaction that normally happens when a fearful thought goes completely unchallenged. It creates a small gap, a moment of choice, where instead of being swept along by the thought's momentum, you get to decide whether to keep feeding it or whether to deliberately set it down and replace it with something true. This replacing piece matters as much as the noticing piece. It's not enough to simply notice a fearful thought and try to push it away, because thoughts that get pushed away without replacement tend to come right back, often stronger. The practice isn't subtraction alone removing the fearful thought, it's substitution, deliberately bringing in something true to stand in its place. This might be something as simple as recalling a specific moment where God's faithfulness was visible in your life before, even in a completely different situation, and using that memory as evidence against the current narrative that nothing ever gets better. It might be quietly repeating a truth about God's character, not as a magic phrase that makes fear disappear, but as a deliberate redirection of attention, a way of feeding the mind something other than the spiral it wants to keep running. This is, importantly, not a single victory. You win once and never have to repeat. The anxious mind doesn't get permanently retrained after one successful interruption. It's closer to physical training, where a muscle doesn't become strong after one workout, but gradually, through repeated use over time, the same motion becomes easier, more natural, more automatic. The first 100 times you catch a spiraling thought and consciously redirect it, it might feel exhausting, like you're fighting against a current that wants to pull you back every single time. But this is exactly how the pattern begins to shift. Not through one dramatic breakthrough, but through the slow accumulation of many small redirections, repeated consistently enough that they start to become the new default rather than the effortful exception. There's something deeply empowering in recognizing this, because it shifts you out of helplessness. If you believed, even unconsciously, that anxious thoughts simply happen to you, and there's nothing to be done except endure them, then every spiral feels like proof of your own powerlessness. But if you understand that thoughts can be noticed, examined, and redirected, even if imperfectly, even if it takes many repeated attempts, then you're no longer purely a passenger inside your own mind. You become someone with genuine agency in this particular battle, not controlling the external outcome, which was never the point, but actively participating in what happens internally while you wait for that outcome to unfold. This is, in many ways, what it actually looks like to exercise faith in the middle of fear. Not the absence of anxious thoughts arriving, but the active practice of not letting them have the final word every single time. And as this practice deepens, something begins shifting that's worth naming clearly. The fear doesn't necessarily disappear completely, especially not quickly, but its grip loosens. The thoughts still arrive sometimes, but they no longer automatically dictate how the rest of the day feels. And in that loosening, something else starts to become possible. Something that looked impossible back at the very beginning of this. Lying awake at night, convinced that fear and faith could never coexist. Convinced that feeling afraid meant failing completely. What actually changes, in the end, when all of this starts working together? What does it look like when trust finally begins to outweigh fear? Not perfectly, not completely, but enough to actually feel different than where this all started. So, here you are, having walked through all of this, and it's worth pausing to notice what's actually shifted. Even if it's not dramatic, even if the original situation still hasn't fully resolved, because that's the truth that needs to be said plainly. This entire journey was never really about making the uncertain circumstance disappear. The job situation might still be unresolved. The health concern might still be unclear. The relationship might still be finding its way. None of that has necessarily changed, simply because something has shifted internally. And yet, something real has happened. Something that matters just as much as the external resolution you've been hoping for. Maybe even more. You started this with a quiet but heavy belief that anxiety meant you were failing at faith. That feeling afraid proved something was wrong with your relationship with God. That real trust would have erased the fear completely if only you were spiritually strong enough. That belief made every anxious night feel like double weight, the fear itself, and then the shame layered on top of it. But that belief was never actually true. Anxiety was never proof of failed faith. It was an invitation, a signal pointing toward exactly the place where dependence on God needed to grow, exactly the place where your own grip on control needed to loosen. The fear wasn't the enemy of your faith. It was, in its own strange way, the doorway into exercising it more fully than before. You've seen that the illusion of control, the constant mental effort to secure an unknown future through sheer thinking, was always exhausting, precisely because it was never actually possible. Releasing that illusion wasn't giving up responsibility. It was recognizing the real boundary between what's yours to carry and what was always meant to be surrendered. You've seen that silence isn't the same as absence. That God's presence doesn't depend on whether the answer has arrived yet. That prayer can be about realigning with His nearness in the present moment, rather than only measuring His care by how quickly circumstances change. You've seen that waiting seasons, as uncomfortable and disorienting as they are, aren't punishment for some failure you can't quite name. They're formation, slow and often invisible. The same way a foundation has to set quietly before anything visible gets built on top of it. And you've seen that the real battlefield was never actually out there in the uncertain future at all. It was inside your own mind, in the thoughts running on repeat, in the patterns that either deepened the spiral or, with practice, slowly began to loosen its hold. None of this required the outcome to resolve first. That's the part worth sitting with carefully, because so much of the original fear was built on the assumption that peace could only come after the uncertainty ended, after the answer arrived, after the future became clear. But what's actually been happening through all of this is the discovery that trust doesn't require certainty about outcomes. It only requires confidence in God's character. Those are two very different things, and confusing them is part of what made all of this feel so impossible at the start. You don't need to know what's going to happen with your finances, your health, your relationships, your future, in order to find a steadier place to stand right now. You need only to know, more deeply than before, who God actually is in the middle of not knowing, that He is present even in silence, that He is faithful even in delay, that He is near even when the timeline doesn't match what you hoped for. This is the turning point that's been building through everything you've walked through. The quiet realization that God's apparent silence was never abandonment, and that trust was never meant to be contingent on having the outcome figured out in advance. Confidence in His character can exist fully formed, right now, tonight, regardless of whether tomorrow's circumstances have been revealed yet. And so something begins shifting. Not instantly, not perfectly, but really. The fear that used to feel like proof of failure now feels more like a familiar visitor, one you recognize, one you know how to respond to differently than before. It still shows up sometimes. That's honesty, and it should be said clearly, because the goal was never to arrive at a permanent state where fear never visits again. The goal was to change your relationship to it when it does. Instead of being swept along automatically by every anxious thought, you've learned to pause, to notice, to ask whether what you're feeling is actually true or whether it's fear speaking louder than truth. Instead of gripping tightly to an unknown future, trying to secure it through endless mental rehearsal, you've practiced setting it down repeatedly. the way anyone learns a new habit, through consistent small returns, rather than one dramatic breakthrough. Instead of interpreting silence as distance, you've learned to bring your attention back to presence, even while the bigger answer is still pending. This is what it looks like to move from fear to trust, not as a finished destination you've fully arrived at, but as a direction you're now walking in. Consistently, even imperfectly. This is what it looks like to move from confusion to clarity. Not because every question about your future has been answered, but because the central misunderstanding has finally been corrected. Anxiety was never the absence of faith. It was always the invitation to exercise it. And this is what it looks like to move from heaviness to peace. Not the peace of having everything resolved, but the peace of no longer carrying it entirely alone. The peace of remembering that your responsibility was always smaller than you thought, and God's presence was always nearer than the silence made it feel. Tonight, when the familiar fear rises again, and it likely will, because that's simply part of being human in an uncertain world, you now have something you didn't have before. Not a guarantee that the outcome will go the way you hope, not a formula that removes fear permanently, but a different posture toward it. A practice of naming it honestly. A practice of setting down what was never yours to control. A practice of returning to His presence again and again, as many times as it takes, because that returning is not failure. It's faith in its most practical, repeated, lived out form. If this spoke to something real in you tonight, take a moment to let it settle. And if you'd like to carry this further, consider liking this video, leaving a comment about what stood out to you, and subscribing for more reflections like this one. You don't have to know what tomorrow holds to be steady tonight. You only have to know who's holding you while you wait to find out.